Good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Entz, and I'm here at the Glenlea long-term rotation on July 17th, 2020. And if you don't know it's 2020, you can also tell by my mask. But because I'm social distancing from our camera photographer today, I can take my mask off. So I'd like to welcome you to the Glenlea long-term rotation here in southern Manitoba. We're about 20 kilometers south of Winnipeg, pretty well in the longitudinal center of the country. So we have been filming and showing you some of the research that we've been doing here over the years. What I'd like to do today is just to highlight a couple of the major findings that we're seeing in the rotation this year. If you would like to see the whole rotation, you can watch last year's YouTube video, because one thing about this long-term study is that the trends that we're seeing, the long-term trends that we're seeing, seem to be quite stable from year to year. So just so that we all know what the age of the rotation is, we're in the 29th year of the study. So the first point I want to make is what we're doing to improve the grain-only organic rotation. So this is a rotation that only has grain crops, certainly no hay crops in the rotation, and we've had a lot of challenges with this rotation, especially after about 12 years. So behind me is a plot of oats, and it looks not too bad. The rotation here is a green manure. That was a very nice meadowlark song in the background, by the way. The rotation here is a green manure, then wheat, then flax, and then oats. The green manure that we used to grow in here was pea oat, and what we found is that green manure did not supply enough nitrogen for the three subsequent grain crops in the rotation. So we substituted that green manure with a hairy vetch barley green manure, which we'll look at in a few minutes. That green manure has been much more effective, and you can see the oats here are a little bit more nitrogen rich than they have been in the past. So we have the hairy vetch green manure, then wheat, then flax, and by the time we get to this oat crop, the fourth crop in the rotation, there's still some nitrogen left. So this is one way that we've improved the grain-only rotation. But we also, in many years, have weeds in these rotations, especially wild oats. And so what we've done in this grain-only rotation is we're just going to walk over here, and I'm going to show you what we've done to try to address the problem, especially of weeds and also of nitrogen. We've inserted a perennial alfalfa phase in the rotation, so we split the plot. So if you look down the plot, this used to be all one long plot. So the back half is still the hairy vetch barley green manure, which was seeded this spring. But in the front half here, we hit a pause button on the grain rotation and put in a 5-year alfalfa stand, which served a number of purposes. The first is to try to get our wild oats under control. The second was to really stock up the soil with more nitrogen. And the third was to add subsoil carbon, because we had observed in this grain-only organic rotation that the carbon deeper in the soil was being depleted, and we thought the alfalfa phase would help that. Now, the alfalfa is managed in a simulated grazing situation. We did have sheep actually graze the plots in 1 year, but that was impossible to manage, so we just flail mow it. So what we're going to do is go to the back of the plot and take a look at the hairy vetch barley. You can see the alfalfa here. It's been grazed once already this year, and it grows really well in this soil. There's no evidence of any phosphorus deficiency here, even after 29 years of grain production, and certainly the soil tests show high levels of available phosphorus still in this soil. So here we have the hairy vetch barley green manure, And as I mentioned, this is an improvement from the pea oat green manure that we used to grow here. Now, a pea oat green manure or a pea faba bean green manure may be really a very good choice in a very drier area of the prairies, perhaps where somebody does not grow peas for grain. But in this area of the Red River Valley, there's a lot of potential to produce more nitrogen. And so the nice thing about this system is, we're mostly interested in the hairy vetch. The way this is managed, this will get rolled, and so we'll crimp roll the barley out of here. The hairy vetch will continue to grow. And this has the potential of fixing 120 to 160 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, or that's pretty close to 120 to 160 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So it's been a big improvement over the past green manures. But what I'd like to do now is we're going to go look at the wheat which we plant after the hairy vetch green manure and after the alfalfa pause, and we'll see how they compare. Now here we have the wheat which is growing after the alfalfa in the foreground, and in the background we have wheat growing after the hairy vetch barley. Now if we look at those two wheat crops, we can see they're both quite healthy, nice and dark green, so there's a sufficient amount of nitrogen for both the wheat after the alfalfa and the wheat after hairy vetch. But you'll notice there are more weeds in the plot at the back where we just had the 1 year of hairy vetch barley, and there are no wild oats. I think I counted one in this plot here where we had the 5 years of alfalfa. And that demonstrates a point that we've documented in other research, that 3 to 5 years of alfalfa is a great way to virtually eliminate many of the wild oats out of a cropping system. The wild oats that grow in patches, those what we call the sort of the parent patches, they are sometimes very difficult to get rid of. But for all intents and purposes, we've eliminated the wild oats. So that's the wheat after alfalfa, and in the background the wheat after hairy vetch barley. And now we're just going to walk over to the next plot, which shows what happens in the following year. So here, remember, the rotation in this study is the green manure, hairy vetch barley, then wheat, then flax, and then oats. And so here we have flax after the wheat. And in the foreground, I'll let you kind of guess which half of this plot had alfalfa and which half did not. Well, the plot in the foreground had alfalfa, and the plot in the background was wheat following hairy vetch barley. And what we can see here is we've got an excellent flax crop in this plot here. But we have more mustard where we've had the alfalfa, and that's probably because there's more nitrogen available even than where we had the hairy vetch barley. So that's one of the things, one of the values of these long-term studies is to learn these kind of trends. Which of these flax crops is going to yield more? Well, we will know at harvest time. But I suspect this one here, where the flax follows the wheat that followed alfalfa, will yield more. The plants are taller. They certainly looked a lot better early in the year, but they have more mustard competition. If we come back here in a week, the mustard will have finished flowering and it will look much nicer. But anyways, that is a depiction of the flax after the alfalfa versus the flax after the hairy vetch barley. So what have we learned in this rotation? One thing we've learned is that having a green manure that supplies more season-long nitrogen, season-long growth to make more nitrogen is much better than what we started out with, which was a pea oat green manure, or sometimes we added some soybeans to that, so we had a pea, soybean, oat green manure. Sometimes we used faba beans. I mean, we've been doing this for three decades, so we've experimented with lots of different things. But we know that nitrogen contribution of legumes is really a function of how much biomass that legume produces. And the hairy vetch simply produces a lot more biomass than any of those annual legumes. There are some other options that farmers could use. They could use some sweet clover, some red clover, some crimson clover along with the barley, hairy vetch, maybe to reduce the price of the green manure. So whatever gives you season-long legume growth will give you more nitrogen. So that's one thing we've learned. And the second thing we've learned is that by adding a 5-year alfalfa stand to the rotation, we're getting better thistle control, and we're definitely getting better wild oat control. But in terms of mustard, we actually may be getting more mustard when we increase the supply of nitrogen to the rotation. And that's a bit of a dilemma. So really the answer here is maybe we should be growing the flax in slightly wider rows and using some robotic interrow cultivation system to control these mustard plants better. Maybe we should intercrop this flax with another crop, say lentil, which will help compete with these mustards. So that's the learning process. And some of that work we're doing at our organic site in Carmen. So those are some of the things that we've learned. And we are, maybe one final point, we are interested in looking at the soil carbon in these systems to see whether it's been worthwhile adding the 5 years of alfalfa to increase the soil carbon. We certainly know that in the surface soil, the alfalfa definitely has improved the tilth of the soil, the infiltration, the organic matter, but we're also interested in what happens deeper in the profile. So I'm standing in front of the second crop rotation that we have here at Glenlea. This is we call it the forage grain rotation. It contains 2 years of a forage mixture that's cut for hay, and then it goes to wheat, and then it goes to flax, and then back to the forage mixture, which is usually alfalfa, some grasses, timothy, orchard grass, and some clovers. So here I'm standing in front of the plot that was seeded to wheat after the forage. So last year this was the second year of the forage, and here we have the wheat. Well, what do we think of this wheat? It looks quite good. The weeds aren't too bad. There's a little bit of volunteer alfalfa, but not too much. But there is, are there wild oats? There really aren't very many wild oats here. There are some, but one of the things that we know is by regularly having the forage, which is cut for hay, in the rotation, we do keep our wild oat populations lower. We don't eliminate them, but we keep them lower. The second thing you can note here is we have some quack grass. And so here's some quack grass growing. And that can happen in a forage rotation. But here, I would have to say that the quack grass is really an artifact of our study. We have these alleyways on either side of the plots, and some years those alleyways get contaminated with quack grass, and we don't always get around to controlling it. And so it has slowly crept into the plots. So I'm not going to say that we would not have quack grass in a forage grain rotation, but here I believe it's mostly an artifact of how we've done the research. So we're trying to improve our quack grass control in the alleyways. The other weed that we do have challenges with from time to time here is Canada thistle. And we do know that Canada thistle is controlled by the forage and rotation. At least there's usually fewer Canada thistle plants here than other years. We had a very odd winter, and we had a tremendous amount of winter kill of lots of different perennial species. We lost a lot of alfalfa in this area, not in our study, but in surrounding farms. And we lost some reed canary grass in some experiments, and so I think the Canada thistle actually did not survive the winter quite as well. And I attribute that to some sort of late winter thaw, and then it froze again and we had ice encasement, which is very, very damaging to perennials. But anyways, back to the wheat. If we look at the back half of the plot, we can see the wheat is shorter. And if you've watched these Glenlea videos in the past, you'll know that we split these forage grain rotations. The front half receives composted beef cattle manure, the back half does not. And so what we're seeing here is a response of the crop to the composted beef cattle manure. The way it works at Glenlea is the beef cattle manure actually makes the forage grow better and helps it fix more nitrogen because in the back part of the plot where we've never added any nutrients, any composted manure, anything, we have a phosphorus deficiency. So our forages don't grow that well there. That means they don't make that much nitrogen, which means our wheat is somewhat nitrogen deficient. Another thing that we've learned here in the study. So this is wheat after 2 years of forage and our forage grain rotation. This is the 29th organic crop in the study. That means the last time herbicides or fertilizers were used here was 30 years ago. This is the flax crop that follows the wheat in the forage grain rotation. So just to remind you of the rotation, 2 years of forage, then wheat, and then flax, and then back to forage. So guess which half of this flax crop is in the long-term manured section? I'll give you a hint. The phosphorus in the manure helps mustard grow because mustard is a non-mycorrhizal crop. It cannot access phosphorus easily without having it available. And so you are correct. The back half of the plot is the half that regularly gets some composted beef cattle manure. And the front half does not, has never had any nutrient addition for 30 years. Which plot is better? Well, the flax in the front part of the plot is growing quite well. And there's very little mustard. There's a little bit of foxtail in here. Both mustard and foxtail are thought to be non-mycorrhizal. We know mustard is non-mycorrhizal. We think foxtail is also non-mycorrhizal. But flax is highly mycorrhizal. That means it associates with those beneficial fungi in the soil and allows the flax to access phosphorus, which is not readily available to the wheat, to the forage, and to other crops. And so here, what we've noticed historically is that the flax in the front half of the plot actually yields more than the flax where we've added compost into the system. So what's the lesson here? Do we want to have poor alfalfa growth because we don't want to add manure? No, we don't. What we need to do is to improve our weed control systems in those parts, in those rotations where we do add nutrients. And that is work that's going on elsewhere, but it's really nicely demonstrated here at the Glenlea rotation. Some of the lessons that we've learned in this organic rotation, the 2-year forage, the wheat flax, we've learned that the composted beef cattle manure is really critical to growing good alfalfa. We've learned that wheat really responds to that alfalfa because it needs the nitrogen to grow. But then we've learned that the flax seems to grow reasonably well even where there's relatively low levels of nitrogen and very low levels of phosphorus. The phosphorus in this soil right here in the front is about 3 parts per million phosphorus, maybe 4. That's considered critically low, and it is low. It's not recommended even in an organic system. So that if we do amend these soils with nutrients, we need to improve our weed control systems. One of the other lessons that we've learned in the Glenlea long-term rotation regards the nitrate concentration all the way down to 300 centimeters. So what we did in all the plots a number of years ago, 2 years ago, is we sampled the soil in 30 centimeter or 1 foot increments. And what we're learning is that the prairie plots always have the least nitrogen, and there's no evidence of nitrogen leaching ever. We use that as our benchmark. But what we found at the bottom here, and I don't think you'll be able to see the legend, but I'll just explain it. But what we've actually seen is that this forage grain rotation, whether we add the composted manure or not, has a slight but statistically significant increase in the amount of nitrate leaching. So this is something that we've observed at Glenlea. We have a little bit of light nitrate leaching in the rotation that I just showed you. And it's not alarming right now. It's very, very small concentrations, but it's significantly different from the conventional plots and from the prairie. This is something people have also measured in Europe, where it's a lot wetter. Other work in Western Canada has showed that nitrate certainly can leach, especially when you combine legume-based systems with periods of fallow. Dr. Con Campbell and his colleagues at Ag Canada in Swift Current documented that really, really carefully many years ago, almost 25 years ago, in their long-term studies. So how do we avoid that nitrate leaching? We avoid it by growing catch crops after we terminate the alfalfa. And that's certainly something that we've now done a lot of research with, and lots of farmers are interested in late season cover crops, especially in humid areas like Ontario, Quebec, eastern Manitoba. But I thought I would share that result with you. So here we're at Glenlea in front of the conventional plots, because the way this study works, and one of its values is to compare conventional agriculture and organic agriculture, or whatever we call conventional agriculture. So here we have the grain-only rotation under conventional management. The rotation is soybean, then wheat, then flax, and then oats. This spring we zero-tilled all of our conventional crops, so we saved that tillage operation which the organic crops required. And you can see the soybeans are behind me here. And this is a Roundup Ready soybean variety, and that's why it's quite clean. We actually did not put the second Roundup application on here because the soybean is doing a very good job competing with the very little bit of green foxtail that's there. So the first crop in the rotation is soybean, and then we're just going to walk over to the next plot, which is wheat. The soybean, of course, receives no nitrogen. This wheat received about 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. You can see it's a nice looking wheat crop. There's a few wild oats, but not many. And then you can think about how this crop looks compared to the organic crop. It yields probably about 25% higher than the organic wheat typically. And then the next crop in the rotation is flax. And you're going to be alarmed when you see this flax crop, or you're thinking that we should be alarmed when we see this flax crop. In this particular replicate of the study, we have Group 1 resistant wild oats, and that's what you're seeing in this wonderful flax crop. So just to back up, the rotation is soybean, wheat, flax, and then oats. And the flax was no-tilled here into the wheat stubble. Beautiful crop of flax, but the wild oats have been a problem in this replicate for over 10 years. They're herbicide resistant. We've sprayed them with all kinds of different herbicides. And it wasn't until we added Roundup Ready canola into this rotation that we started actually getting on top of these herbicide-tolerant wild oats. But they do show up in certain crops, and you can see they're going to cause a lot of yield damage here. And then the final crop in the rotation is oats, and the oat crop looks beautiful. It's been fertilized with about 90 some odd, maybe close to 100 kilograms of nitrogen. It was zero-tilled into the flax stubble. And you can see also some herbicide-tolerant wild oats in here, but oat is much more competitive than flax. So even though, of course, there's no wild oat herbicides for wild oats in oats, we do have some of these weeds, but it's going to be a pretty good oat crop here. And then this rotation will go back to the the soybean next year, and that soybean year really helps us drive those wild oat populations down, and that's what we've been observing here at Glenlea. So this is the conventional rotation, where we just have grains, and not all of our replicates have these herbicide tolerant wild oats. It's only this replicate. So it makes the experiment tricky, but it is part of the farming system. Now, I wanted to make a final point, is when you look at these conventional crops, you think these are gorgeous crops. I mean, notwithstanding the herbicide tolerant wild oats, these are very nice crops. And they are nice crops, and they do yield more than the organic crops. But if we look at other indicators of success, we know that this rotation here requires a lot of fossil fuel energy. We may not have needed to do any preceding tillage this year, but we do add a lot of nitrogen fertilizer here, and nitrogen fertilizer makes up about half to 65% of the energy budget of any grain-based cropping system in Canada. And so the organic system is really one of the things that we're learning, is how to create high-yielding crops without that fossil fuel nitrogen source. The other thing we know about conventional crops is that they can contain heavy metals, because heavy metals like cadmium actually come along with the phosphorus fertilizer. And it's been a problem in Canada, it's a problem around the world, and long-term studies have shown, if you look at the food quality of these crops can be higher in cadmium. And then there's the challenge of just being so reliant on herbicides, and we can see that system can sometimes fail. But anyways, that's a little bit of an overview of the Glenlea plots. We're not quite finished our tour today. We've got two additional things that we'd like to show you in the video.
Hi, my name is Sarah Wilcott, and I am a research technician at the U of M, working on the long-term studies that we have here. I started about a year and a half ago. This is my second field season working on these studies. I got my master's degree at the U of S, looking at reducing nitrous oxide emissions using 4R nutrient management. I spent a lot of time when I first started working on the archive for specifically the Glenlea rotation. So we have a lot of grain samples from almost every year, as well as soil samples throughout the study. This is one of 5 of the studies that I'm working on. It's been a really great experience. I like being able to get out here, work in the field, and I'd like to acknowledge the Western Grains Research Foundation for supporting long-term studies at the U of M.
One of the privileges that we have working on these long-term studies is we get to interact with other scientists who are doing similar work around the world. And there are about, maybe about 25 studies around the world that are similar to this organic conventional comparison at Glenlea. And we were invited last year to write a book chapter, and in this textbook called Long-Term Farming Systems Research, Ensuring Food Security in Changing Scenarios. So I'll turn to the book chapter in just a moment. So here is the book chapter that we wrote. It's called Building Capacity from Glenlea, Canada's Oldest Organic Rotation Study. And I just want to acknowledge the people that have helped. Michelle Karkner led the writing project. Keith Bamford, who was our long-term technician here, he has just recently retired. Joanne Thiessen-Martins, Sarah Wilcott, who you met in the video, April Stainsby, Catherine Stanley, Calvin Dick, and myself as the project leader. And so what we did is we didn't just write up the results, the yields and things like that. Those have been published elsewhere. But what we did in this book chapter is we discussed how we've used this study to help organic farmers and to help the organic sector identify problems and overcome those challenges. So thanks for joining us on today's tour of the Glenlea long-term rotation, July 17th, 2020. I would invite you to follow us on Twitter, and you can also link to our website, which contains some of the past work that we've done. I wanted to change hats just for a moment and just end off with an acknowledgement of collaboration that we've had doing not the same type of work, but sustainable agriculture work in East Africa. We've worked with the Canadian Food Grains Bank and all of their partner organizations in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, looking at the role that conservation agriculture can play in improving soil health, and we've just completed the final report for that study. But the reason I wanted to share it today is because the principles that we're learning here at Glenlea are very similar to the principles that are required to develop a sustainable agriculture in other parts of the world, including East Africa. And the things that we're learning from farmers there are very valuable, and we're bringing that knowledge back here as well. So, thank you very much for participating. Stay safe and be well.